The cold wind of the north blew across the snowy fields of Winterfell, sharp and bitter like old memories. Jon Snow stood on the training grounds, sword in hand, watching the younger boys spar. He wasn't a boy anymore, not after everything he'd seen beyond the wall, but still deep inside. He felt like the same unwanted child who had grown up as Ned Stark's bastard. Ghost lay quietly nearby, his red eyes watching everything. Jon had just returned from the wall after the Battle of the Long Night. The north was still healing, and Winterfell, though damaged, was slowly rising again. Everyone called him a hero, some even whispered of him as a king. But none of it meant anything to him, not without truth, not without knowing who he truly was. One evening, Samwell Tarly came to Jon's chambers with a tired face and a scroll in hand. "Jon," he said carefully, I found something in the Citadel, an old record hidden away in a forgotten shelf. It's about your mother and your father." Jon's face turned pale. "I already know, Sam, you told me. Rhaegar Targaryen was my father. Lyanna Stark was my mother." Sam shook his head slowly. "That's what we thought. But this scroll says something else. It's a record of a secret meeting between Robert Baratheon and Lyanna. Before her supposed kidnapping, it says they were lovers. That Lyanna was pregnant before Rhaegar ever laid a hand on her." Jon stared at him, stunned. "No, that can't be." "I checked it twice," Sam whispered. "And there's more. A midwife from Dorne wrote a letter to Maester Pycelle. She was with Lyanna when she gave birth. She wrote that the child had dark hair, not silver. Lyanna said the child's name was Jon, and that Robert could never know." Jon sat down, his hands shaking. "So, you're telling me Robert Baratheon is my real father?" Sam nodded slowly. "Yes," Jon laughed bitterly. "The man who hated Targaryens. The man who started a war because he thought Lyanna was stolen from him. Was my father all along." Sam said nothing. The next day, Jon went to the crypts of Winterfell. He stood in front of Lyanna Stark's statue, the place where the truth had started to unfold before. Only now everything had changed again. "You kept it from me," he whispered to the stone face. "Why? Why hide me from him?" He remembered Robert Baratheon, a loud man with a wild laugh, a heavy drinker, a king with a broken heart. Jon had never felt any connection to him, but now everything made a strange kind of sense. The black hair, the strong build, the anger that burned in his blood. He had more of Robert than of Ned or Rhaegar, but the truth didn't make him feel whole. It made him feel hollow. Was this better than being a Targaryen? Or worse, would the world see him differently now? Would Daenerys? As he walked out of the crypts, Jon saw Sansa watching him from the balcony. She seemed to know something had changed. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said gently. "I have," Jon replied. "His name was Robert Baratheon." Sansa's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" But Jon didn't answer. He kept walking, lost in a storm of thoughts. If Robert was his father, what did that make him? A Baratheon? A rightful heir to Storm's End? Or just another pawn in a Game of Thrones? He didn't want thrones. He didn't want power. But now power might come for him again, this time in the name of a stag, not a dragon. And deep down, a darker question was rising inside him. If Robert had known, would he have loved Jon? Or killed him? Jon rode alone that night. The snow crunched beneath his horse's hooves as he crossed the old trail, leading to a quiet hill just beyond the edge of Winterfell. The moon hung low, casting pale light on the frozen woods. His thoughts were louder than the wind, storming through his mind with every breath. He needed space. He needed to think. The truth burned inside him like wildfire. He wasn't Ned Stark's bastard. He wasn't a Targaryen prince. He was the unwanted son of Robert Baratheon, a man who had started a war out of love, only to never know what came from it. Jon remembered the man from years ago, Robert, with his wine-stained beard, laughing like thunder, calling himself a warrior king, while Ned stood silently beside him. Jon used to envy that bond between them. Now he realized it could have been him. That could have been his father teaching him how to fight, how to rule, how to laugh like the world owed him nothing. Instead, he was raised in the shadows by a man who called him son, even when he wasn't. Jon stopped near an old tree where he and Robb used to play. He dismounted and sat under its bare branches. His breath came out in white clouds. Ghost lay beside him, silent and watchful. "I don't know who I am anymore," Jon whispered. Ghost didn't move, but Jon felt his warmth beside him. He stayed there until the sun rose, unsure of what to do. He didn't want the truth to change anything, but it already had. Every memory he had of Winterfell now felt like a lie with a new name written over it. When he returned, Sansa was waiting for him in the courtyard. She had that look again, the one she wore when she knew something she wasn't ready to say out loud. "You disappeared," she said. "I needed air." "You found more than that, didn't you?" she asked, stepping closer. "You found something that's shaken you." Jon stared at her for a long time, then nodded. "I'm not who we thought I was," he said. "Not a Stark, not a Targaryen either," Sansa frowned. "Then who?" Jon hesitated. Saying it out loud still felt wrong. "Robert Baratheon was my real father. Lyanna loved him. I was born of that love. Not Rhaegar." Sansa took a step back like he'd struck her. "That changes everything," he nodded. "I know. No, Jon, you don't, if this is true. If word gets out, then you're not just some noble bastard. You're Robert's only true-born son. You have a stronger claim than Gendry. The Baratheon line was thought to be dead. You could take Storm's End, or the throne." Jon's face darkened. "I don't want the throne, but someone else might want you to have it," Sansa said sharply. "You know how people are. They'll use this." "They'll use you?" Jon turned away. "Let them try," but she wasn't finished. "And what of Daenerys? She accepted you as Aegon Targaryen. That alone nearly broke her. What happens when she finds out you're Robert's son?" He hadn't thought about that. Daenerys had built her war on the ashes left behind by Robert's rebellion. Robert had killed her family, chased her across the sea, made her an exile. He was her enemy, her father's murderer. Her hatred for him was bone deep, and now Jon carried that man's blood. He felt a bitter taste rise in his throat. That night he met Daenerys in the Great Hall. She was sitting alone, staring into the fire like it might show her the future. When she saw him, her lips curled into a soft, tired smile. "You're troubled," she said. "More than usual." He sat beside her and took a long breath. "I need to tell you something." She turned toward him, listening. "My mother was Lyanna Stark, but my father—" "It wasn't Rhaegar," her brow furrowed. "Then who?" "Robert Baratheon." The silence that followed was louder than any war horn. Daenerys didn't move. Her face didn't change. But something in her eyes shattered. "No," she whispered. "I have proof," Jon said. "Sam found it. A midwife's record. A maester's letter." Daenerys stood slowly. Her voice trembled, not from fear but from fury. "Robert murdered my family. He butchered my brother, hunted me as a child, and now you tell me you are his son?" Jon stood too. "I didn't choose this, Dany." She stepped back as if his presence hurt her. "But you carry his blood. The blood of my enemies. Is that what I am now?" he asked. "Your enemy?" She didn't answer. Jon watched as something cold and dangerous took root in her eyes. He had lost her. He knew it, and maybe the war hadn't ended at all. Winterfell grew colder, but not from snow. Since Jon revealed the truth, Daenerys had barely spoken to him. She moved through the halls like a ghost, silent, calculating. Her once warm eyes now filled with quiet fury. The Dragon Queen, who had once looked at Jon with love, now looked at him like a threat. Jon knew that look. He'd seen it before in Cersei's eyes, in Stannis's, in men who wore crowns and saw only enemies. The fire between them had died, and something darker was growing in its place. That morning, Tyrion came to him. The hand looked tired, older than Jon remembered. He held a cup of wine in one hand and a scroll in the other. "She knows," Tyrion said, without needing to explain who she was. "I told her," Jon replied. "She had to know," Tyrion sighed. "And now she doesn't trust you." Jon didn't respond. Tyrion stepped closer. "Do you know what happens when a queen loses trust in her allies? Heads roll, alliances crumble, empires fall. I don't want her throne. But people think you do," Tyrion said, voice sharper now. And that's what matters. Jon stared at the fire crackling in the hearth. What would you have me do, lie? I'd have you live, Tyrion said coldly. And right now your life hangs by a thread. She's holding it, and her grip is slipping. The next day, word spread like wildfire through the north. Jon Snow, the bastard of Winterfell, was the true-born son of Robert Baratheon, not a Stark, not a Targaryen. A Baratheon. It started with whispers in the kitchen. Then guards spoke it aloud. Small folk repeated it like a chant in the market square. Soon the northern lords began to murmur, if he's Robert's son, Storm's End belongs to him. He has royal blood. He could take the throne. Better him than the Dragon Queen. Sansa watched it all unfold with cool, measured eyes. She had said nothing publicly, but she didn't stop the whispers either. She let the seed grow. That night she came to Jon's chambers uninvited. You're becoming dangerous, she said simply. I've done nothing. You exist, Jon. That's enough. She paused. You told her the truth, and now she sees you as a rival. She won't forget that. She won't forgive it. Jon rubbed his face, exhausted. I didn't ask for any of this. No, but you were born into it. And people are already choosing sides. Jon looked up at her. And which side are you on, Sansa? She didn't answer. That silence said everything. In the weeks that followed, Daenerys changed. She grew colder, more distant. She held meetings without Jon, made plans with her own council, and began strengthening her grip on the north. Not through kindness, but fear. Her unsullied patrolled Winterfell's walls. Her Dothraki rode through the countryside, and her dragon, Drogon, loomed like death in the skies above. Then came the final blow. Jon walked into the great hall one evening and found Daenerys seated on the Stark throne. A parchment was in her hand, and Ser Davos stood beside her, his jaw tight. What's this? Jon asked. Daenerys looked at him like a judge before a guilty man. A letter from King's Landing. Gendry has been declared Lord of Storm's End by royal decree. Jon blinked. Gendry? My loyal subject, she said, voice cold. Robert's other bastard. He has no claim. But he is loyal. Jon felt the insult cut deep. You gave him what was mine. I gave him what you refused to ask for, she snapped. You want no throne, no title, no power, but you refuse to disappear. That's the most dangerous kind of man. You think I'm your enemy now? I think you could become one, she said without flinching. And I don't wait for enemies to rise. Jon clenched his fists. He could feel the eyes on him. Grey Worm. Tyrion, Ser Davos, even Arya standing in the corner. Her face unreadable. The room was full, but Jon had never felt more alone. That night, Arya came to him quietly. She'll kill you, she said. No hesitation. She won't, Jon said. Arya stepped closer. She already has in her mind. I can see it. She's thinking about it. Planning it. Jon stared into his sister's eyes. I won't kill her, Arya. I didn't say you had to. He grabbed her arm. Don't, promise me. But Arya pulled away and her voice dropped to a whisper. You better choose, Jon, because the game is moving again. And if you're not playing, you're being hunted. The snow fell harder the next morning, covering Winterfell in a thick white blanket that hid the blood beneath. Tension had turned the castle into a cage. Every look was suspicious, every word carefully measured. Jon could feel it. Winterfell no longer felt like home. It felt like a trap. Daenerys had changed. She no longer walked among the people like she once did. Now she watched them from the towers, always guarded, always surrounded by Unsullied and Dothraki. She held meetings with her commanders behind closed doors, without Jon or the Northern Lords. Her dragon circled the skies more often now, like a warning. But the people saw more than she realized. Jon could hear it in the silence when he passed. The way servants avoided his eyes. The way northern bannermen no longer spoke freely in the halls. Fear had come to Winterfell, and it wore a silver crown. That evening Sansa summoned him to the Godswood. The red leaves swayed gently in the wind, and the old heart tree stood as it always had, quiet, unmoving, watching. She's preparing to leave, Sansa said, not looking at him. Jon frowned. For where? King's Landing. She says she wants to claim the capital peacefully, but she's gathering all her forces. She won't wait. Jon felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the snow. She wants me to go with her, he muttered. She wants to watch you, Sansa corrected. To keep you close. To make sure you're not planning anything. Jon shook his head. I'm not, but I am, she said plainly. Jon turned sharply. Sansa, she's not safe, Jon, not for the North. Not for you. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were steel. You saw what she did to Varys. You saw how she looks at people she doesn't trust. She hasn't hurt me. Not yet, Sansa said. But you're not her ally anymore. You're her problem. And you know what Daenerys does to problems. Jon looked down at the snow, heart pounding. He remembered the fire, the screams of Varys as he burned, the look in Daenerys' eyes as she gave the order, unshaken, unmoved. That was not mercy. That was power protecting itself. She's not mad, Jon said quietly. She's desperate. She lost so much, and how many more have to die for her grief? Sansa asked. You think she won't do to King's Landing what she did to the slavers in Meereen? To the men in Korth? You think she won't do it here if the North refuses her crown? Jon didn't answer. He couldn't. Later that night, he found Tyrion in the library, sitting with a half-empty bottle of wine, staring into the fire. She'll burn the city, won't she? Jon asked without greeting. Tyrion didn't look up. She believes fire is the answer to fear, and she's very afraid. Jon sat down across from him. I never asked for any of this. That's exactly why you're dangerous, Tyrion said softly. People follow men like you. Men who don't seek power, but still command respect. Daenerys sees it. She knows it. That's why she's watching you so closely. Jon ran a hand through his hair. If I leave, if I disappear, will it stop? Tyrion met his eyes. No, because as long as you're alive, you're a threat. You could kneel 1,000 times, swear 100 oaths, and still people would whisper. About the Baratheon blood. About the throne. Jon stood. So what am I supposed to do? Kill her? She's the woman I loved. Tyrion's voice dropped to a whisper. Then you better choose what matters more, your love for her, or your duty to the realm. The next morning, Daenerys called a war council. All were present, unsullied commanders, northern lords, even Tyrion and Arya. Jon stood near the edge, silent, watching her. She wore black again, a red dragon pin on her chest. Her voice was firm, her plan brutal. We march south in 3 days, she said. We will take King's Landing. I have given Cersei one final chance to surrender. If she refuses, we show no mercy. There were no cheers, only silence. Then Daenerys turned to Jon. You'll ride with me. At the front. It wasn't a request. Jon nodded stiffly. As the council ended and the room cleared, Daenerys approached him. Alone. You haven't spoken to me in days, she said. I've had a lot to think about. Her eyes narrowed. About who you are? About who we are, Jon replied. You and me. She stepped closer. We were something once. We still could be, he said quietly. But not like this. You're turning into something you promised never to be. Her voice dropped. I am doing what I must. Jon looked into her eyes, so full of fire, and yet so far from the woman he had once known. And when does it end, Dany? After King's Landing? After the Northbows? Or does it only end when everyone fears you more than they love you? Her lips tightened. Fear is all I have left. Jon stepped back. Then I fear for all of us. As she turned and walked away, Jon knew something had broken that night. Not just between them, but in the realm. The storm had begun, and he was standing in its center. The snow had stopped falling, but the cold hadn't gone anywhere. It had settled deep in Jon's chest. He felt it in his bones. 3 days later, the army moved. Winterfell's gates opened, and Daenerys' forces spilled out like a black tide. Dothraki riders thundered across the fields. The Unsullied marched with silent discipline. Northern soldiers followed with uneasy steps, eyes filled with quiet dread. They weren't marching for their own queen anymore. They were marching beside a dragon. Jon rode near the front, just as Daenerys had ordered. Ghost wasn't with him. He'd left the direwolf behind, a silent goodbye. Arya had tried to talk to him before they departed, but he had shut her out. He couldn't handle more warnings. He knew what they all thought, that he was next on Daenerys's list, that if he didn't act, someone else would, but he wasn't ready to act. Not yet. They made camp halfway to King's Landing, near the ruins of an old village burned during Robert's rebellion. As the soldiers rested and sharpened their blades, Jon sat alone near the edge of the trees, staring into the flames of a small campfire. The same fire that warmed him now could also devour cities. He'd seen it with his own eyes, what dragons could do. He heard footsteps behind him and didn't turn. "I thought I might find you here," Tyrion said, easing himself down onto a nearby log. "You always go to the fire when you're thinking." Just like a man who wants to believe it still brings warmth, Jon didn't smile. "You shouldn't be seen with me too much." "She's watching." "She's always watching," Tyrion muttered. But she stopped listening. There was a pause. "I spoke with Varys," Tyrion said carefully. Jon looked up sharply. "He's dead. Yes, burned by the woman we're all following. But before he died, he left letters. Sent a few. His birds are still flying even in death. What letters?" "Your truth," Tyrion said. "Your blood." "Robert's son, the heir. Varys believed you were the last hope for peace." Jon stood suddenly. "They told him I didn't want it. And he believed you," Tyrion said, eyes rising to meet his. "But the question is, does she?" That night Jon couldn't sleep. He paced outside his tent, armor still on, sword at his hip. The stars above offered no comfort, no guidance. Then he saw Arya. She emerged from the shadows like a ghost, silent and calm. She'd been riding with the scouts, but she wasn't dressed for battle now. She wore black, soft, quiet clothing, the kind she wore when death was close. "She's planning something," Arya said without greeting. Jon didn't ask who. "She's not waiting for surrender. She's going to burn King's Landing, no matter what." Jon swallowed hard. "You're sure?" Arya nodded. "I've seen her eyes. I've seen the way she looks at people. She's not ruling them, Jon. She's punishing them." Jon stepped back. "There are children in that city, innocents. She doesn't care." Jon sat down on a fallen tree, running his hands through his hair. "I swore myself to her. I told her she was my queen." Arya's face didn't change. "And now you have to decide if that oath is worth more than thousands of lives." Jon's voice cracked. "She was the woman I loved." Arya crouched beside him. "Then make sure she doesn't become the woman you regret." The next day, they reached the outskirts of King's Landing. The army formed along the ridges, preparing for siege. Tyrion went to beg Daenerys one last time, to show mercy, to wait for surrender. She barely listened. Jon stood outside her war tent later that night. The guards let him in without a word. Inside, Daenerys stood alone, staring at the map table. Her fingers hovered over the miniature red keep. "You came," she said without turning. "I had to." She turned to face him, eyes shining, but not with tears. "With something colder. They will not kneel," she said. "They never do." "They might," Jon said. "Let the bells ring. Let them surrender." Her jaw tightened. "They rang bells for my family once too, right before they were butchered in their sleep." "This isn't revenge," Jon said firmly. "You told me we were going to build a better world." "We will," she whispered. After the fire, Jon stepped closer, placing a hand on her arm. "There's still time, Dany. Don't become what you've always fought against." She looked up at him with soft, breaking eyes. "I only have one thing left. You. Everyone else betrayed me." Jon froze. She leaned closer. "Be with me, Jon. Rule with me. Burn it all, and we'll build something pure." Jon felt her hand on his chest, the smell of ash and fire on her skin. "I can't," he said softly. Her eyes turned hard, then she stepped away. In that moment, Jon realized the choice had already been made, and the bells would not save anyone tomorrow. Dawn broke red. From the hills outside King's Landing, Jon sat on his horse and watched as the sun climbed above the city's walls. It cast a crimson light across the rooftops, bathing the Red Keep in firelight before the battle had even begun. A grim omen. Dothraki riders shifted restlessly to his left. To his right, the Unsullied stood in perfect ranks, silent, still, deadly. Behind him, the northern troops held their ground, but unease trembled through the lines. These weren't their people. This wasn't their war. Jon's fingers tightened around the reins. His heart pounded, not from fear of battle, but from dread of what was to come. Then the roar came. Drogon. He burst from the clouds like a demon from hell. Wings wide, fire spilling from his throat as he passed over the armies and headed for the city walls. And behind him, Daenerys, her eyes locked on the city, no mercy, inside the city. The bells of surrender had not yet rung, but the people were already screaming. They scrambled through the streets, trying to flee to the Red Keep, but there was nowhere to go. Mothers held children, old men limped beside them. The gates had been sealed hours ago. Cersei watched from her tower, confident the city would hold. She had no idea what was coming. Jon gave one last glance toward the Golden Company across the field. They were prepared for battle, well-armed, well-paid, and unaware they were about to be turned to ash. Then, with a scream like the sky had split in half, Drogon dove. Fire exploded along the front lines. The Golden Company never even had a chance to raise their swords. They were incinerated in seconds, flesh turned to smoke, bones to dust. Horses ran flaming into the hills. Men scattered in panic, Jon's breath caught. It had begun. Daenerys didn't wait for the gates to fall. Drogon smashed through them, reducing iron and stone to molten rubble. The Unsullied charged, followed by Dothraki screams. Jon and his northern soldiers hesitated. He turned to Grey Worm, who stood beside him. "The bells," Jon said sharply. "We wait for the bells." Grey Worm didn't reply. He only nodded once, and when the gates opened, he charged into the chaos. Jon followed, though every part of him screamed to stop. He drew his sword and entered the fire. King's Landing was a nightmare. Flames devoured buildings. Ash rained from the sky. The screams were endless, soldiers, civilians, children. The Unsullied cut through everything. The Dothraki chased down fleeing men. Fire rained from above, and still no bells. Then suddenly, they rang. High above the city, the bells of surrender rang loud and clear, echoing through the smoke. Jon stopped in his tracks. Others did too. A moment of silence, a breath of hope. It was over. Then Daenerys struck. Drogon screamed and turned. Instead of heading for the Red Keep or the remaining soldiers, he dove into the heart of the city, into the homes, into the crowds, and fire fell like judgment. Jon's heart shattered. She had made her choice. This wasn't war. This was punishment. Jon turned, saw Grey Worm driving his spear through a surrendering Lannister soldier, saw the Unsullied killing men who dropped their swords, saw Dothraki chasing children down alleyways. He screamed for them to stop, but his voice was lost in the roar of fire. A woman stumbled out of a burning house ahead of him, holding a child. Her face was burned, clothes half melted. She locked eyes with Jon, desperate. Then Drogon passed overhead. Jon tackled them both, covering their bodies with his cloak just as the fire hit the street. The world turned white-hot, the air thick with burning flesh. When it cleared, he stood, shaking. The woman was unconscious. The child was dead. Jon looked around. Nothing but corpses and ash. And then he saw Arya. She stood across the street, covered in dust and blood, her face blank. Not with fear, not with pain, but with rage. Jon stepped toward her, but she turned and disappeared into the smoke. He knew where she was going, and suddenly, so was he. Jon turned away from the battlefield, ignoring the orders, the chaos, the blood. He ran through the smoke, through the fire, toward the Red Keep, toward Daenerys. Because now he knew the truth. This wasn't about love. This was about stopping a queen who thought she was a god, and Jon Snow was done watching. The Red Keep was burning. Jon climbed the stairs 2 at a time, boots slipping on blood and ash. Every corridor reeked of smoke and death. The marble floor was cracked, red-hot embers glowing between the stones. The once proud castle of the Targaryens was falling apart, just like the dream that had brought them all here. He passed fallen soldiers, Lannisters, Unsullied, even northern men, bodies tangled together, their war meaningless now. He could hear the dragon above, roaring, as Daenerys unleashed another wave of fire upon the city. Each blast shook the ground like thunder. Jon's lungs burned. His throat was raw from the smoke. But he didn't stop. He had to reach her, not as her soldier, not as her lover, but as the only person left who could still stop her. Near the top of the keep, he found Tyrion. The hand of the queen was on his knees, staring at the rubble that used to be the small council chamber. The table was half melted. The map of Westeros was split down the middle. "She did it," Tyrion whispered without looking up. "She burned them all." Jon stopped beside him. "Where is she?" Tyrion's eyes rose, bloodshot and empty. "Where she always wanted to be, on top of the world." He pointed toward the throne room. "But be careful, Jon. You're not the first man to love a conqueror, and you won't be the first to die for one." Jon didn't reply. He kept walking. He pushed open the great doors of the throne room, and the world fell silent. Snow, or maybe ash, drifted from the broken ceiling. The Iron Throne stood untouched, black and sharp against the pale ruin of the hall. And there she was, Daenerys. Her back was to him. She stood before the throne, staring at it as if she'd waited her whole life for this moment. Her silver hair was streaked with soot, her armor glinting in the firelight. Drogon roared in the distance, but did not enter. Jon stepped forward quietly. "Dany!" She turned, and her eyes softened when she saw him. For a brief heartbeat, she wasn't the queen who had burned a city. She was the woman he once held on a cold northern night. "You came," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jon's heart clenched. "What have you done?" Her expression flickered. "I freed them." "You killed them," Jon said, his voice breaking. "Children, mothers, men who had already thrown down their swords. They were slaves to a tyrant." She snapped. "To fear. To a broken world that never gave mercy. I gave them freedom in fire." Jon shook his head, stepping closer. "That's not freedom, Dany, that's death." Her eyes shimmered with tears, but her smile was strange, distant. "You don't understand. They will thank me one day. When the world is born anew, they will see." Jon stared at her. "You sound like your father." The words hit her like a blade. She flinched. "Don't compare me to him." "Then stop acting like him." For a long, awful moment neither spoke. The air between them was thick with smoke and heartbreak. Then Daenerys reached out, her hand trembling. "Jon," she whispered, stepping closer. "You don't have to fight me. Be with me. We can rule together, the last blood of fire and storm. You, a son of Robert, me, daughter of the dragon. Ice and fire united." Jon looked down at her hand, at the woman who had burned a city to ash, and felt his heart tear in two. "I loved you," he said quietly. "More than I ever thought I could love anyone." Her smile grew hopeful. "Then nothing else matters." Jon's eyes filled with tears. "But it does." Before she could speak again, he pulled her close, one last embrace. She sighed against his chest, believing it was forgiveness. Then he drove the dagger into her heart. The sound she made was soft, almost peaceful. A gasp more than a scream. Her hand pressed weakly against his chest, then fell. He held her as her body went still, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." When he laid her gently on the floor, Drogon landed outside the shattered walls with a furious roar. The ground trembled as the dragon's shadow filled the throne room. Jon looked up as Drogon's massive head pushed through the archway. The beast saw her. His mother, his queen, lifeless in the man's arms. Jon stood still, unflinching. "Do it," he whispered. Drogon let out a cry that shook the heavens. But the fire didn't come for Jon. Instead, it poured onto the Iron Throne. The steel melted, turning to liquid fire, dripping and hissing until nothing remained but slag. The symbol of power burned to nothing. When it was done, Drogon lowered his head beside Daenerys' body. With one massive claw, he lifted her gently, curling his wings around her. Then with a single beat of his wings, he rose into the ash-filled sky and disappeared into the clouds. Jon fell to his knees in the silence that followed. The city burned below. The throne was gone, and the man who never wanted power was now the only one left standing in a kingdom of ashes. Days passed, maybe more. Jon wasn't sure. Time had stopped meaning anything the moment Drogon flew away with Daenerys' body. He hadn't run. He hadn't fought. When Grey Worm found him in the ruined throne room, sitting in silence beside the melted remains of the Iron Throne, he didn't resist. They bound his hands and dragged him to the black cells beneath the Red Keep, the same dungeons where Mad King Aerys had once kept his enemies. Now his last daughter's killer sat behind the same bars. Jon said nothing in his defense. He didn't beg. He didn't cry. He simply sat in the darkness, waiting for justice. Or death. Outside, the city groaned under the weight of what had been done to it. King's Landing was a carcass, burned, broken, and filled with silent corpses that no one had the strength or stomach to bury yet. The air reeked of ash and rot. The Red Keep's towers stood shattered, and smoke still rose from half the city. There was no queen, no king, no throne. And in the absence of power, chaos crept in. Grey Worm wanted Jon executed immediately. He demanded it, screamed for it. But there were no lords left to authorize such a sentence. Not yet. And Tyrion, shackled in a nearby cell, refused to stay silent. He insisted a council be formed. The last queen burned the city because she ruled alone. He said to anyone who'd listen, "We must not make the same mistake again." So the remaining powers of Westeros gathered in the Dragon Pit. Not to choose a ruler, but to decide what came next. Sansa Stark, Arya, Davos, Gendry, Brienne, Samwell, Yara Greyjoy, the new Prince of Dawn, Robin Arryn, taller now but just as uncertain, Edmure Tully, fumbling to find relevance, Bran Stark, calm and quiet in his wheeled chair. They argued for hours. Some wanted Jon executed for the Queen's murder. Others called him a hero who saved the realm from another tyrant. Sansa demanded his freedom. Grey Worm threatened war. Tyrion, still imprisoned, was dragged before them to speak. He looked at them all, tired and unshaven, and said, "You've spent hours arguing about justice, about vengeance, but what you should be deciding is who we are now. Is this the world we want? One built on fire and punishment? Or something better?" They listened, they debated, and in the end, they compromised. Jon Snow would not die, but he would not be free. They came for him at sunrise. When the door to his cell opened, Jon blinked against the sudden light. It was Davos who stepped inside, face somber. "They've made a decision." Jon stood without a word. "You're to go back to the Night's Watch," Davos said. "Not for punishment, but for peace. No crown, no land, no glory, just the wall, the north." Jon gave a sad smile. "Seems I always end up where I started," Davos shrugged. "Maybe that's where you were meant to be all along." He was given a horse, a fresh cloak, and nothing else. No send-off, no parade. Just a cold ride north, away from the city of ash and the throne of bones. As Jon passed through the gates of Castle Black once more, the memories flooded back. The wind, the cold, the sense of being forgotten. He was older now, harder, but somehow still the same. Tormund waited for him with a grin. "Didn't think they'd let you live," he said. "They didn't," Jon muttered. "Not really." Ghost barked from behind a snowbank and ran to him, leaping into Jon's arms. For the first time in weeks, Jon smiled, truly smiled. He spent the night at the wall, staring out at the endless white beyond, and at dawn he rode north, past the gate, past the wall, into the lands beyond. Free folk followed him. Tormund, Ghost, and dozens more. Not as his soldiers, not as his enemies, but as people who simply chose to walk beside him. There was no war left to fight, no queen to serve, no throne to kneel to, just the snow, the trees, and peace. Back in King's Landing, Bran the Broken was crowned king. Sansa ruled the north as its own kingdom. Arya sailed west of Westeros, seeking the unknown. Tyrion remained hand as punishment and duty. The world began again, and far in the north, where no songs were sung and no statues would ever be built, lived a man who had loved a queen, killed a dragon's mother, and walked away from power, not as Jon Snow, not as Aegon Targaryen, not as Baratheon's son, just as a man trying to live.